Michael Sheen, you star in Masters of Sex as sex researcher William Masters, and the show aired its second season last summer and is coming back for the third season in July. And there was a lot of change in that second season. New characters, new settings. Big time jump in the season. Was it challenging as an actor to adjust to so many changing circumstances for your character?
It was great actually, and that we're just in the middle of shooting the third season now, and that continues even more really in the third season. When we first started talking about the journey for the characters and the story, it was always for me about change in a way, on a sort of big picture scale. The fact that we go from the kind of culture, certainly the way people perceived sex and sexuality in American culture in the 50s. Part of what would be interesting about the show was to see how the culture changes and how people's perception of sex and sexuality and that relationship between the culture and the subject, how that would change in a markedly different way through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So it was always going to be about change in that respect. But in terms of the characters, one of the things I was most excited about and what I was drawn to in the character was the fact that we were looking at a man who was going to change so much from the beginning of the story to sorry, there's an insect buzzing around me here, of how a man would change so much through the course of the story. And that was partly what informed how I wanted him to come across right at the beginning. I wanted to sort of portray a man who is so imprisoned within himself, really, and so defended and so guarded and so difficult and jagged in all kinds of ways. And to be able to see him have to deal with that and confront that and change through that over however many seasons we get to do. So the changes and the jumps were a big part of what I really relished about the character, and marking, well, what needs to happen to him at this point in order for him to take another step forward, and does he take a step back, and how does he cope with that? Because the change is not something he particularly wants. Part of him really wants it. Another part of him is resisting it and fighting it tooth and claw all the way and punishing everyone else around him for the fact that he's changing in certain ways. So I found that really exciting to kind of mark that journey.
And you mentioned the progression of eras on the show, moving from the 50s and into the 60s the show was in, and potentially in the future to the 70s and 80s, with so many different, changes in just American culture and, over the course of those years, the fashion, the style, the values. Is it almost like, a completely new production every season in a way?
I think part of what's exciting about it for us as a cast and as a crew, and also for the audience, are the things that are different. I think, it's just sort of on some level very exciting to see people with different hairdos and different clothes and that kind of thing. But I think it's the relationship between what is different and what is consistent that I think ultimately is hopefully satisfying and interesting for an audience, and certainly is for us. It's being able to look at who these people are, in my case, who Bill Masters is, what is driving him, what is the conflict within him, and how does that continue, through the journey of the character, whilst other things change around them. And so I think it's the combination of the two that's interesting and challenging.
The time jump episode in the middle of the second season, the episode Asterion, which comes right smack dab in the middle of last year, and it moves the story forward like 3 years. What was it like shooting that episode in particular, where you're trying to convey basically 3 years worth of character development and story development in a single episode?
Yeah, well, it was very scary in some ways, because on the one hand, the way we work on this show is really looking at the minutiae of what's going on psychologically and emotionally for the characters, and the real detail of how the dynamic changes between Bill and Virginia at any one point. It's such a kind of chess game in some ways, that they're really looking at, from second to second almost, things are shifting and changing. So when you put that much investment and ask for that much investment from the audience in terms of how the minutiae of things change, to then go, oh, and now it's 3 years later. You've asked people to invest in watching what's going on from second to second, and now you're asking them to deal with the fact that, 3 years have gone by. So that was always going to be difficult. But we knew from the beginning of the story that we have to make these time jumps because we have to cover so much ground. And we wanted to. So it was always going to require these time jumps. And I suppose in some ways the simplest way of doing that is to make them just between seasons. But we thought, well, no, we should take on board the fact that, the difficulty of doing it within a season. How can we explore that, and how can we make that into a virtue somehow and make that exciting? So we were both excited by the prospect of doing that within a season. But also, I think what we partly learned is that you need to spend a lot of time working through that beforehand. You can't just do that, not that I'm saying it was done on the hoof, but you sort of want to be able to leave certain things confusing for an audience, I think, and go, hang on, what's happened in the 3 years? And partly you want to present them with where the characters are at without it over explaining it, and maybe leave room to explain things or see things a bit later on, not to give everyone everything they want immediately. I think it's quite nice to be dropped down in the middle of a new landscape and not know where you are and have to figure it out. I think that can be quite interesting, as long as you give enough for the audience to still have a sort of satisfying experience and not for the confusion of that to overwhelm them. And also, if you don't do enough to move things along, then that can be really unsatisfying, I think, as well. If you jump 3 years, you want to see that these characters have developed in some way, and and things have moved on. So with season 3, that will be happening as well. There's a big jump that's happened again in between seasons rather than in the season this time, and that has changed a lot of things for them.
What would you say? Bill Masters has been going through such an evolution over the course of the series and over the course of the actual man's lifetime. Going from the one end of that time jump to another end 3 years later, what do you think was the biggest change in the character, for you to play before that happened and coming out the other end?
Well, I think the process for Bill, in terms of how he's developing, control is at the heart of who he is or who he's become. I think, we've found out more and more about what his experiences, what the formative experiences were for him when he was a child. And the main one was his relationship with his father, which was an abusive relationship. And I think one of the things that can come out of an abusive relationship of some kind when you're young, or certainly a traumatic relationship with your parent in some way, can lead to an issue around control. That if the universe presents you with something that is incredibly traumatic as a child, I guess it can lead to you feeling like it's total chaos. The universe has no meaning. There's no order. Just awful things can happen out of nowhere. And that can, not always, but it can lead to someone trying to overly gain control in their personal life. As a kind of response to an out of control universe, they try and control the universe as much as they can. and that can become problematic. And it certainly has become problematic for Bill, because it doesn't work like that, And so his version of the way the universe works and the way that he tries to control it has been working quite well for him up until our story begins. And then an element comes into that, i.e. Virginia Johnson, that kind of speaks to something that doesn't fit his plan. There was no room in his plan for this chaotic element to come into it, to start making him feel things that threatens to tear apart everything that he's controlling. And yet on a deeper level, he desperately needs that. He desperately needs, just for who he is as an authentic person, to kind of answer that call. So this kind of conflict within him, the man who is all about control, suddenly having an uncontrollable element, not only on the outside of him, but within him, threatening to pull all that down. So on the one hand, he wants to move towards that and answer that call. On the other hand, he desperately, everything he knows about the world and about himself requires him to not answer that call. And so that inner conflict in him, that fight, he then projects outside. So he has to punish the very person who is creating that in him and everyone else around him. So this is a long-winded way of answering your question, which is, the journey for him really in a sort of bigger picture way is about letting go all the time. The one thing he never wants to do is let go, because that's about ceding control. But he has to kind of learn that. And so everything that happens to him in the entire story is always another step along the journey of having to let go of something, having to give up control about something. So whenever there's a big time jump, the thing I always have to ask myself, and that we talk about in terms of the character of Bill, is where is he at in that respect? You know, how much has he let go of? How much is he able to tolerate not being in control? How much does when there's a crisis of some kind, how much is he tempted to revert back to old habits that he now knows don't really work for him that well? And so, you know, he's not the same man as he is at the beginning of the show, where he has no self-awareness about a lot of things. He now has self-awareness and yet can't stop himself from doing things the way he has done before, but is tentatively trying to do things differently. And how does that affect the relationship with Virginia? How does that affect his ability to be vulnerable with her, vulnerable about other things, change his mind about things, admit that he's wrong about certain things sometimes? All those things. It's all baby steps with him, but whenever there's a time jump, that's what we have to really think about, and how he comes out the other end of it. And again, like I say, as we go into season 3, there's a lot more progress in that.
Before that time jump episode, one of the most memorable episodes of the season, and I think the series so far, was the episode Fight, which is basically this two-hander between you and Lizzie Kaplan in a hotel room, and that's where we get to learn a lot more about, Master's childhood and his upbringing. It was almost like watching a play to watch that episode. Is that sort of how it felt like to shoot it?
Yeah. Well, it didn't feel like a play. It felt like doing very long scenes for a camera. But yeah, there's definitely a sort of play-like aspect to it, in that it's one set, and two characters in there, and obviously relies much more on the dialogue and that kind of thing. But what was quite scary again going into that episode was how much do you reveal? When for me in season 1, I always used to talk about it like Jaws, that if you see too much of the shark, it's just not interesting anymore. It's just getting glimpses of the shark that makes you, getting glimpses of what might be under the surface is what becomes compelling, I think. And so season 1, a lot of it, the whole point of what I was trying to do in season 1 was to not show too much of the shark all the time, and to be aware that there's something going on and you don't quite understand what it is. And and then season 2, especially with that episode, with episode 3, Fight, where more is revealed than has been revealed up until that point. The danger was, if you reveal too much, then people go, oh, it's a shark. Oh, it's an alien. Oh, right, okay. You still want to be able to keep, because that's the engine of the character. So I was very sort of vigilant and vocal about trying to make sure that we got the balance right in that episode of how much is revealed and how much isn't revealed. And also what I thought was really interesting was that as it continued, what is revealed eventually is also up for question. Like, it's not just about revealing something, a character suddenly revealing, his history and what has been going on. There is a vulnerability and an intimacy in revealing that, but also later on in future episodes, we start to go, hang on, is that true? And with Virginia as well, a big theme of season 2 was about the stories we tell ourselves and the narratives we create out of our life in order to hold on to a sense of oneself or a sense of how the world works, and how they can often be questionable, how the truth of those stories can often be questionable, and they serve a purpose. And that when Bill's brother turns up, suddenly his personal narrative about what he grew up with and how he coped with it and the choices he made, and now the choices he's continuing to make and the life he has made, suddenly comes up for grabs because his brother is saying, no, that's not what happened. And that becomes very interesting. I thought that was fascinating to explore as a character, that for a show that is about vulnerability and intimacy, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological, the act of revealing to someone some truth about yourself that you have tried to guard or defend or hide kind of defines what vulnerability is, how intimacy is achieved. that two people show each other things that they don't want the rest of the world to see, and that creates a kind of a bond of intimacy. And that's a lot of what happens in that episode 3 fight. But a lot of those things that are revealed then turn out to be maybe not true. And how much does the character know they're not true, and how much have they convinced themselves it's true, and does that undermine the intimacy that is created? It was fascinating, all that. I think, you know, a more conventional way of showing a relationship developing would just be character has a secret, character reveals secret, and the person that he reveals it to becomes closer to him because of that. And we never question whether it's true or not. But in this, you know, it goes beyond that. It's about, is someone able to allow the very story that they tell themselves about their life, is someone able to relook at that and maybe accept criticism of that, even when they've revealed something that is so precious and sacred to them. And so I thought that was fascinating.
You mentioned, you know, getting to meet, you know, Master's brother, played by, you know, Christian Borle, and you know, unraveling that whole, you know, aspect of his childhood and his memories, you know. And you and Borle are both theater veterans. He, in fact, just won his second Tony Award recently.
Yeah.
What was it like to develop that, you know, such an intense relationship, and one, you know, where you have to develop all that history between those two characters? What was it like working together on that?
It was fantastic. I loved it because it gave me an opportunity to really delve into the real complexity of this man, you know. It was interesting, actually, because me and Michelle Ashford, you know, the showrunner and chief writer, we almost at exactly the same moment came into work one day, and we both sort of said to each other, what if his brother turns up? And which is often how we kind of work on the character of Bill, is that Michelle and I will come up with ideas or say, you know, what about this or what about that, and then we'll sort of talk about it and go off and think about it and then come back together again. And we almost simultaneously came up with the idea of Bill's brother coming into it. I suppose partly because it allowed us to look at an aspect of Bill that you wouldn't be able to really look at in any other way. It needed someone who shared his history with him to be able to come in and show a different side of that history somehow, and that would force him to open stuff up. And so, you know, when we were looking for an actor to play the brother, to play Frank, you know, on the one hand, we needed someone who physically sort of resembled me, but also someone who was almost like you know, who was Bill, but Bill who'd gone off on a slightly different journey. So I suppose it's no coincidence that it ended up being an actor who also had a shared history in theater and that kind of stuff. And it ended up, interestingly, like the kind of big pivotal scene between us, which slightly resembled Fight in a way. I think it's the second biggest scene that we've ever done in Masters of Sex in terms of how long it went on for and how it played out, which is the scene which ends with me kind of manipulating Frank into beating the shit out of me. And the way we did it was that it ended up being on the set. There was this huge area on the set that we never really used. It was the kind of lobby area outside of our offices. And there was a kind of sunken kind of pit in the middle of it, it seemed like. And it always struck me as being kind of, I always used to make jokes about how we were going to flood it and create gladiatorial battles, naval battles through the ages like they used to do at the Colosseum, because it sort of looked like that. And then eventually I thought the idea of the gladiatorial arena kind of suggested to me that that's where this big confrontation should happen between me and Frank. And so, which was a very theatrical idea. And so we have this kind of big scene where everything that I've been trying to, you know, deny, and, you know, I've built this story up that I left my parents and left the house when I was 14, and that he was fine. My younger brother was fine because he was never being abused by my father. Like that was, and yet my brother comes along and says, no, that's not what happened, and throws all that up. And I desperately don't want to accept the truth of that. But I also don't want to accept the truth that the reason why my father did it was because he was alcoholic, which is what my, you know, brother is saying. And so I end up using my brother as a weapon to beat myself up, to prove to him that he's wrong, which is such a kind of addictive logic to kind of, you know, people always say, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? And at that point, Bill just wants to be right. doesn't want to be, and to see a man with like his own blood coming down his face, having made his brother do something to him that has really hurts his brother more than hurts him, even though he's the one with the blood coming down his face. It was such a kind of self-destructive thing to do. And so to have an actor like Christian, who absolutely was in there for it and was absolutely on for exploring these things and doing a big, long scene like that, which moves so much and has so much complexity in it, really exploring that was amazing to be able to do that with Christian.
You mentioned that scene with the brother. There's so much anger and cruelty sometimes within Masters because he's suffering so much internally. But he also sometimes pushes Virginia away and lashes out at her. Do you ever wonder at times, or if Masters goes so far that maybe he might lose the audience sympathy, or maybe even lose your sympathy as an actor?
No, he never loses my sympathy because it's all, I always know where it's coming from. This is a man who, the child in the man was taught cruelty by his father, by someone who was supposed to protect him and support him and nurture him and care for him, actually just meted cruelty out to him constantly, random, for no reason, no justification. And people talk about children's magical thinking, where you connect dots that aren't meant to be connected. If you have a father who is just beating the crap out of you for absolutely no reason, and yet he's supposed to be the man who loves you the most in the world and is teaching you how to view the world, that creates a very warped sense of self, of love, of relationship, and of the world. And so it's always come from that. That's what I've always been trying to explore. So I will never lose sympathy for him, because I'm depicting someone who is fighting for his life, essentially. He's grown up with an incredibly warped view of who he is. I mean, he hates himself. His self-loathing goes beyond any how he deals with any other character. His own ugly view of himself. The title of the episode that you talked about earlier, Asterion, comes from a story about the Minotaur, King Minos, and that became the kind of underlying myth of this man, this character for me, about a child who is hated by his father so much that he is put in the middle of a labyrinth, and he turns into a monster. He has the head of a bull, and then people are sent as punishment into that labyrinth, and they come across this monster in the middle of it who just destroys them, and yet that monster is actually this child, this abused child who's been abused by his father. And that I found really interesting, and we ended up calling that episode Asterion because of that. But so I never lose sympathy for him, even though he is perceived as a monster by other characters and by the audience at times. It always has to be grounded in how he was turned into that monster, and he's a monster who is trying to undo that. That's the point of the story for me. So he's always constantly now in a inner conflict between the monstrous part of himself and the part of himself that is trying to escape from his own labyrinth. And the moments where that kind of contradiction come out the most, I think, are moments like when he punishes Virginia for things, or when with his brother he ends up getting his own brother to beat him up in order to prove a point about something. It's those moments that are fascinating to me, and also show the vulnerability of the character, I think, which hopefully is what allows an audience to never quite write him off and to stay with him as he's changing and developing. And I hope that they do stay with him, because there's a long way to go with him.
Season 2, another big subject it tackled was the issue of race, which of course during the 50s and going into the 60s, civil rights movement was rising during the era, and we mostly saw that through Master's wife Libby in season 2. But there's also Master's experience in the Black Hospital and his experience with the reporters. What did you think about the show exploring that side of Masters and that aspect of the era last season?
Well, I was always a little wary of it, because I always felt like you can't be a bit of a tourist with this kind of subject. You either deal with it properly and give it the focus and attention that it deserves, and look at it in terms of the complexity of it as much as you possibly can, or you have to, or you don't. I was worried about falling between two stools a little bit. But I did like the way that it was explored. I thought it was, for me personally, I thought it was most successful when it was explored very obliquely, in a way, through this sort of very domestic story of Libby, and the characters that she gets involved with, the brother and sister, and how that played itself out. I thought that worked very well. And so in terms of how it affected Masters, I thought it was interesting that he is someone who, on the one hand, you'd sort of think that he would be, certainly as prejudiced and biased in that subject as anyone else, if not more. But in fact, he has a sort of strange out of timeness about that. He sort of, maybe because he's someone who has had to pretend to be something for so long and actually has a sense of him being something else underneath. It's kind of allowed him to have a greater tolerance for things that other people maybe don't tolerate as much. I don't know. I thought that was quite interesting. I thought it was quite surprising in a good way that he sort of doesn't. He has no issue with going and working in a hospital that white people don't want to go to, and he sort of has a strange naivety about that for a man who has focused so much on his area of expertise, and it's almost like everything else has passed him by weirdly, which I quite like that. So he doesn't quite get why people would have prejudice in that respect. For someone who is so opinionated and so controlling in other ways, he's very open-minded in that area, and I thought that was quite interesting. And that, in fact, we see that Libby is the one who has much more difficulty in that, in that area. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I do think you have to, it's the civil rights era, and what was going on for people at that point is such a massive issue and such a big deal and so important that you do have to be careful about how you tackle that. But at the same time, you can't ignore it, because that would be just as wrong. So I did like the way it was handled on the show when it was done in a very kind of specific, personal way. I thought that worked very well.
Well, I want to congratulate you on Masters of Sex, the second season, and going into the third season. To hopefully just as much critical acclaim as the last two. And thank you very much for talking with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.